What's up, rotters? I hope you're all doing horrendously. In a slight change to our schedule, I'm pushing this week's episode back a week. Basically, I'm off on holiday for the first time in many years and decided to take an actual proper break. And so, next week, Dream Warriors Mike Munzer and Becky Dark will be joining me to discuss Xtro 3, Watch the Skies. Although we weren't sure why you should watch the skies, as everything in the movie happens on land. And so, not to leave you empty-handed, I'm dropping an episode from the Patreon vault. Part 1 of a personal audio essay journey documenting my journey with horror from the very start. Part 2 is out now on Patreon, and Part 3 will be dropping towards the end of the summer. So, I hope you enjoy it. Here it is.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
Now you know what we are. Now you know what you are. You'll never grow old, Michael. And you'll never die. But you must feed. Cry, little sister. Come to your brother. Janie's sister. Love is with your brother.
As horror fans, we're often asked by non-horror fans the semi-irritating question, why? And the apprehension arises, not because it's a silly question or you can't explain it, but for this simple fact. If a person has to ask, why horror? Then they'll never understand why horror. As horror fans, we all begin our partnership with the genre on our own in most cases, but we end up together. Horror is the most varied genre of all, and we ourselves as humans share that level of variation. There's a reason we like horror, and while each reason may be wildly different or only slightly departed from someone else's, there's an unexplainable bond between horror fans the world over, whether you've met in person or not. When confronted with the question, why horror myself, I've given a range of answers over the years, and they're all true in each case, but I want to dig a little deeper and trace the roots of my fascination. In order to know why horror is everything to me today, I need to rediscover what horror meant to me 30 years ago. Why did that little boy find solace in rewatching The Lost Boys for the 6th time? Why did that little boy sit cross-legged 2 feet away from the TV screen, mesmerised by the tar man? Well, the reason he was sat 2 feet away is because nobody had realised he needed glasses yet, but as for the mesmerisation, well, let's have a look at that, shall we? As I head back to the VHS store and answer definitively, for me, why horror?
Are you lost, sweetheart? Are you afraid, honey? Well, why don't you come with me? All right. I'll sing you a song till your mom comes back. God is in his holy temple. Earthly thoughts, be silent now.
I'd like to purchase this. Okay, that's 1026.
Who's Carol Ann?
I've been asked several times what my first, or at least my gateway horror was. I think I've changed the answer over the years due to either new memory formations or just because the timeline is a little blurry. I certainly remember which movies made an impact on me, but the order is somewhat foggy. I have a vivid memory of watching Jaws with my whole family whilst eating corn on the cob one autumn. I think this sticks in my mind because it was a family event, rather than just me. Jaws was one of my dad's favourite films. Whilst not what you'd call a horror fan, he would often recount his experiences of nearly fainting watching Frankenstein from 1958 on the big screen, or the time he had to leave the cinema to splash his face after seeing Pam matter-of-factly hung onto a meat hook in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And so, my guessing is that it was his idea for all of us, that's me, him, my mum and sister, to have a family movie night watching Jaws. The corn on the cob, however, will have been Mum's idea. To this day, whenever I think of Jaws, I think of corn on the cob. It's just one of those things. They're attached. Whether or not that was my first scary movie, I don't know, but I kind of obsessed over it. That John Williams theme was in my head and wouldn't stop playing. I was now petrified of the ocean, but when we went on holiday, I had the wherewithal not to let on, as I didn't want my parents to see that I was mildly traumatized and not let me watch the movie again. I mean, I was only 7 years old, too young to process that deep fear properly, but I was smart enough to hide it. And so I would fake a smile and stride into that unforgiving body of water and pray that Jaws wouldn't get me. Another vivid memory is my first time watching the aforementioned The Lost Boys, Joel Schumacher's sexy, trendy, and funny queer-coded masterpiece. At around 8 or 9, I knew I was different. I knew I wasn't fascinated by girls in the same way my boy classmates were. I wanted the girls as my friends over the said boys. And although I didn't know what it was or what it was called, I was aware of that distinction. I've mentioned before on the pod that I grew up in Thatcher's Britain. You can say what you want about her, but she was vocally against what I was becoming and discovering. She introduced Section 28, the first anti-gay laws in 100 years, in her infamous speech in 1987, in which she claimed, "Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life." Yes, cheated. Wow. This was Britain. This is what was being fed into every home in the kingdom. There was no internet, no more than 4 television channels, and no forums for public discussion and debate. You just had to eat it. Of course, I'm not saying Britain was full of impressionable sheep, but when the leader of the country is damning homosexuality, and the media is referring to the AIDS epidemic as the gay plague, that shit makes an impression, whether you know it or not. And whether or not I was aware of it, it affected me. My generation of queer people were oppressed with a capital O. We were made to believe we will die if we follow our desires, but horror had something else to say. Queer-coded horror is deeper than we all realise, because whether a movie is made intentionally with queer undertones or retrospectively reassessed and moulded as such, it's the genre that embraces quote-unquote monsters, deviants, outcasts, loners, and all queer people have felt at least one of the above at some point in time. We were demonized, and therefore I found my contentment in demons. By definition, to demonize means to misrepresent someone as thoroughly evil or contemptible. Misrepresent. That operative word of the late 80s. And so, The Lost Boys pushed a button I didn't know I had. Here, we're a group of outcasts, banished from the city, who had only each other for community and companionship. They meet the new guy in town, Michael, who doesn't seem entirely comfortable in his skin. There's a darkness within him, a curiosity, a yearning. The Lost Boys recognize this form of loneliness and believe he deep down yearns for what they have. This, of course, is my reading, my take, but the moment that tops it all off is when they reveal to Michael what they really are, after feasting on a gang of bikers drunk around a campfire. The leader of the pack, David, played with the sexiest energy I'd ever seen by Kiefer Sutherland, turns to Michael and says, "Now you know what we are, now you know what you are." And this, for me, is the pivotal moment. Michael, having been desperately wondering what's happening to his body and fighting unusual urges, now has a name for it. He's gay. No, sorry, he's a vampire. He doesn't want to be gay. Sorry, a vampire. And why would he? They're treated like lepers. They have to hide in the shadows. They're even called the Lost Boys. Sure, they have great dress sense as a byproduct, but is it worth the ostracization? He doesn't think so. And in 1987, I don't blame him. Whether or not I was experiencing this reading from the movie as a kid, it's too explicit for me to believe it's not intentional. It all just adds up too well. And whilst I thought I was coming back again and again to see the blood and guts, I was really coming back to absorb the subtext, and perhaps a little bit of Kiefer Sutherland's charisma. So those two toothy movies certainly were formative for me. It was in fact my dad that rented The Lost Boys for me to watch the first time. I often wonder if he subconsciously meant to introduce me to my tribe. I don't want to ask, as I like the ambiguity around it. Also subconsciously means he wouldn't know, even if he had, but if Thatcher was spreading subconscious bias to our parents through our TV screens, why couldn't Joel Schumacher be spreading subconscious retaliation to them too? Either way, I'm grateful to both Joel and my dad for bringing this movie to me. I'm a lost boy for life. May I never be found. Now that the horror bug was wedged deep into my veins, I was insatiable for the genre. Now that my parents saw the joy it brought me and still hadn't caught on that Jaws had permanently scarred me, they allowed me to watch whatever I wanted horror-wise. And so every weekend, we would make a pilgrimage to Aladdin's Den, the local independent VHS store, and I would pick 3 horror movies for £4 for 2 nights and disappear into a world of witches and ghosts and demons. As listeners, you're probably now aware that I lean towards the schlockier side of horror, especially anything featuring a silly monster or little creatures with sharp teeth. And this, of course, was completely due to the VHS cover art. And this is why my parents eventually drew up a rota of whose turn it was to take me, as it was never a quick in and out. It was an event. I wouldn't leave until I had scanned the entire floor-to-ceiling display of boxes in the horror section, and I'd make a note of any new additions and give them a flip to check the thumbnail stills from the movie on the back. Never reading the synopsis, of course. These books were made to be judged by the cover, and that's how they got you. Besides, who was Critters made for, if not the underage? And so this Saturday ritual was my favourite part of the week. Most often, I would rent a movie I'd seen before and then pick 2 first-time watches. I've no real idea why I did that. Perhaps it was a fail-safe, so I'd at least have one that I know I'll enjoy. Of course, I always enjoyed all of them. And so I'd take them back home and stack them by the TV. I wasn't allowed to watch them until the evening, and after any chores or inconvenient social engagements like birthday parties or visiting cousins had been completed. And in this time, I would be imagining what happens in tonight's movies all day long. I would create a potential plot with the images in my head from the back cover thumbnails, and so whilst I was eating cake at Timmy Watson's lackluster 9th birthday gathering, I'd be conjuring up a scene involving that weird fleshy face on the back of the Society big box. Turns out I was definitely off the mark for that one, not the direction I'd imagined, but it was fun to conceptualize. After the Jaws situation, I never really got scared by these movies. Granted, most of them are stupid and silly, or at the most grotesque, but they weren't really made to petrify. There were a couple of instances to the contrary, however. The character of Reverend Kane, played to eerie perfection by Julian Beck in Poltergeist 2, The Other Side, struck fear into my soul that hasn't left to this day. Knowing now that during filming, Beck was actually incredibly ill with stomach cancer, diagnosed 3 years prior. He was on the brink. The cancer was eating away at him and was responsible for his gaunt appearance with sunken eyes and cheeks. He knew he was counting days, but he was determined to complete the movie and make Poltergeist 2 his final appearance. He sadly died during post-production and never got to see the movie. Retrospectively, all of these aspects undoubtedly contribute to the bone-chilling performance that still haunts me to this day. We're watching an actual dying man whose character's objection in the movie is to claw his way back to the realm of the living. I have chills as I say it now. You can't fake that. You can't cheat that. He's looking death in the face, and so are we. Also, to top it off, whilst I was watching the movie for the first time, my dad had sourced a latex old man mask and suddenly started banging on the window from outside, so that didn't help much with the sleepless nights. And while the rest of the movie is so-so and features classic 80s schlock like someone turning into a giant tequila worm, Beck, in his final moments, managed to leave us with one of, if not the, most terrifying performances I've ever seen. What a way to go out, what a legacy, thank you, Mr. Beck. You certainly haven't, nor will ever be, forgotten. Another unfortunate lasting impression was bestowed upon me by Alligator 1980. It's funny, the movie didn't scare me whilst I was watching it, but for some reason, I was plagued by dreams, or nightmares I should say, of an alligator under my bed that would snap and drag my mother away every time she came to give me a kiss goodnight. What's significant about this is that it became a recurring dream, and I couldn't stop it. Perhaps the suggestion that an alligator could live in the sewer clicked my brain into believing they could survive anywhere, I don't know, but the dream was always the same. My mum would walk in the room, I couldn't speak to warn her of the alligator under the bed, and so I had to frantically wave my arms, trying to deter her from coming closer, and she misread this as me calling her towards me, and then snap, she was gone. The reason I'm telling this story is because something strange happened a couple of years later. We were on a family holiday in Florida. On one of the days, we were taken out on a tour of the Everglades on an airboat. I remember being quite bored and wanting to get back to the theme parks, but I bit my tongue and went along with it. My mum was in charge of taking photos and wanted a good shot of us all on the boat, and so asked the tour guide if there's a good spot to get off so she can take a picture of us in action on the boat. After some convincing, the tour guide begrudgingly let my mum hop off and onto a reed-filled mound of land. The boat made a sharp circle and away from the mound so that she could get a good picture. Keeping the engine running, we stopped about, 10 metres away and all smiled and hugged for the camera. Then my blood ran cold. My mum had let the camera go and it was swinging on the strap around her neck. Her arms were up in the air, frantically waving. The next bit is what really shook me. The tour guide said he thinks she wants us to move further back. My dad immediately said, no, I think she's calling us towards her. This was my dream, but a little bit skewed. Instead of Mum misunderstanding my frantic warning to stay away from the bed, the tour guide mistook her beckoning as a signal to move further out. Before I could even think or comprehend what was happening, we were on our way back, and as soon as we got near her, my mum leaped headfirst into the boat, safe. It turned out, as soon as the boat circled away, she heard movement in the reeds behind her, approaching slowly. She was too terrified to turn around and see what it was, or to scream or shout in fear it would bring too much attention to her, and so frantically threw her arms around to signal danger. Although we'll never really know for sure, the likelihood that it was an alligator is overwhelming. My nightmare almost became a premonition. That tour guide needs to be jailed also for attempted murder. It's the Everglades, man. You know this. You don't let people off anyway. That was a tangent, but it's not a story I get to tell that often. But both Poltergeist 2 and Alligator represent looking death in the eye in their own way, and are possibly the only two horror movies that affected me on a deep and possibly mystical level as a kid. Then it was time for Freddy, the man of my dreams. I feel this period of my horror life needs its own episode, and so I've decided to call this episode Why Horror Part 1. The journey is long and ongoing, and it's impossible to wrap up in one spew. And so I bring this first chapter to a close, and later in the year, I'll deliver you the next instalment, focusing on the Elm Street effect and the second wave of 90s slashers and what they meant to me. I will speak to you soon, Rotters. Toodles.
Chinese sister.